Osama bin Laden was born on March 10, 1957 in Riyadh, the capital city of Saudi Arabia. At the time of his birth, Saudi Arabia was a young and growing country. Oil had been discovered a few decades earlier, and the country was becoming richer each year. This oil wealth changed Saudi society. Cities were growing, modern buildings were being built, and the government was becoming stronger. However, even as the country modernized, religion remained a central part of daily life. Saudi Arabia followed a strict form of Sunni Islam, and religious teachings influenced education, law, and social behavior. Osama bin Laden was born into this environment of wealth, religion, and political change. Osama's father, Mohammed bin Laden, was originally from Yemen. He came from a poor background and moved to Saudi Arabia as a young man to find work. Through hard work and good connections, Mohammed built a powerful construction company called the Saudi bin Laden Group. His company became very successful, especially because it won contracts to build and repair important religious sites in Mecca and Medina. These cities are the holiest places in Islam. Because of this work, Mohammed bin Laden became close to the Saudi royal family. His company helped expand the Grand Mosque in Mecca, which made him even more respected and trusted. By the time Osama was born, his father was one of the richest men in the country. Osama was one of many children. Mohammed bin Laden had many wives and more than 50 children. Osama's mother, Hamida al-Attas, was of Syrian origin. She was not one of Muhammad's most prominent wives, and Osama was her only child with Muhammad. Because of the large size of the family, Osama grew up among many half-brothers and half-sisters. Life in the bin Laden household was comfortable and wealthy. The children had access to good education and lived in a large home. However, despite the wealth, the family was known for being religious and somewhat conservative. Mohammed bin Laden believed in discipline and strong Islamic values, and he expected his children to follow religious rules. When Osama was about 10 years old, his father died in a plane crash in 1967. This event was important in his life. Even though Osama was still young, losing his father may have affected him deeply. After Muhammad's death, the family business continued under the leadership of his older sons. The company remained powerful and wealthy. Osama inherited a large amount of money from his father's fortune. This inheritance later allowed him to support causes and groups he believed in. During his childhood and teenage years, Osama attended elite schools in Jeddah. Jeddah is a major city near the Red Sea and is known for being more open and international compared to Riyadh. Many foreigners lived there because of business and trade. In school, Osama was described by some classmates as quiet and serious. He was not known as a troublemaker. He focused on religion and was seen as polite and respectful. However, even in his youth, he showed strong religious commitment. In the 1970s, Saudi Arabia experienced rapid change. Oil prices increased dramatically after the 1973 oil crisis. The country became extremely wealthy. Modern highways, airports, and universities were built. Western companies and workers came to help develop infrastructure. While the government welcomed modernization, many religious leaders worried about foreign influence. Some believed Western culture might weaken Islamic values. This tension between modernization and religious tradition formed part of the environment in which Osama grew up. As a young man, Osama enrolled at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah. At university, he studied economics and business administration, though reports differ about his exact major. University life exposed him to different ideas and people. One important influence during this time was Abdullah Azzam, a Palestinian Islamic scholar. Azzam taught that Muslims had a duty to defend other Muslim lands if they were attacked. His teachings focused on unity among Muslims and the idea of jihad as defense of Islamic territory. These ideas would later strongly influence Osama's thinking. It is important to understand that during the 1970s, many political changes were happening across the Middle East. There were conflicts involving Israel and Arab nations. There were also struggles between secular governments and Islamic movements in several countries. Some Muslims felt that their societies were losing moral direction. Religious revival movements became stronger in response. In Saudi Arabia, a major event happened in 1979 when militants seized the Grand Mosque in Mecca. This shocked the country and led to even stricter religious enforcement by the government. Although Osama was not involved in that event, it showed how powerful religious feelings were in society. Osama's wealth gave him opportunities. He traveled abroad, including trips to Lebanon and possibly other countries. However, he remained strongly attached to his religious beliefs. Friends from university later said he often discussed politics and religion seriously. He was influenced by the idea that Muslim countries were being controlled or influenced by foreign powers. He believed that Muslims should regain strength and independence. By the late 1970s, another major event occurred that changed his life. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Many Muslims saw this as a foreign invasion of a Muslim country. Religious leaders in different countries called for support of Afghan fighters. For Osama, this event became a turning point. The combination of his wealth, religious education, and belief in defending Muslim lands led him toward involvement in the Afghan conflict. He would soon travel to Pakistan and Afghanistan to support the resistance. Looking back at this early period of his life, several key elements stand out. First, he was born into extreme wealth and privilege. Unlike many revolutionaries who come from poverty, Osama had financial security from a young age. Second, religion played a central role in his upbringing. Saudi society emphasized Islamic teachings, and his family supported religious education. Third, he grew up during a time of political tension in the Middle East. Conflicts and foreign interventions shaped his worldview. Finally, his university years connected him with influential scholars who promoted the idea of defending Muslim lands through struggle. In simple terms, Osama bin Laden's early life was shaped by three main forces: wealth, religion, and political change. His father's success gave him money and status. Saudi society gave him strong religious foundations. Events in the Muslim world gave him a sense of mission. By 1979, he was no longer just a wealthy young man from Saudi Arabia. He was someone who believed he had a duty to take action in global events affecting Muslims. This first stage of his life did not yet make him famous or widely known. He was still largely unknown outside certain circles. However, the beliefs and connections he developed during these years prepared him for the path he would take in the 1980s. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan would open a new chapter in his life, moving him from a student and businessman into a participant in armed conflict. In 1979, a major event changed the direction of Osama bin Laden's life. The Soviet Union, which was one of the most powerful countries in the world at that time, invaded Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a Muslim country located in Central Asia. The Soviet government said it was helping the Afghan communist government. However, many Afghans did not want foreign soldiers in their country. They saw it as an invasion. Very quickly, armed groups formed to fight against the Soviet army. These fighters were known as the Mujahideen, which means those who struggle in Arabic. Many Muslims around the world believed that it was their duty to support Afghanistan against foreign control. For Osama bin Laden, this war felt personal and important. He had already been influenced by religious scholars who taught that Muslims should defend other Muslim lands if they were attacked. One of the most important people in shaping his thinking during this time was Abdullah Azzam, a Palestinian cleric and teacher. Azzam strongly believed that the Afghan war was a religious duty for Muslims. He called on Muslims from many countries to travel to Afghanistan and join the fight. These volunteers became known as Arab Afghans because many of them came from Arab countries. In the early 1980s, Osama bin Laden began traveling to Pakistan. Pakistan shares a border with Afghanistan and became an important base for Afghan resistance fighters. Many training camps, refugee camps, and supply centers were located there. Osama used his personal wealth to support the Afghan cause. He helped fund the building of guest houses for Arab volunteers who arrived in Pakistan before crossing into Afghanistan. These guest houses gave fighters a place to stay, eat, and prepare for battle. At first, Osama was not known as a military commander. He was more of a supporter and organizer. He helped raise money from wealthy donors in Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries. He used his family connections and business experience to move funds and supplies. He also helped build roads, tunnels, and camps for the fighters. Because his family owned a major construction company, he understood logistics and engineering. These skills were useful in a war where fighters needed mountain paths, shelters, and hidden storage areas. During this period, the Afghan War became part of a larger global struggle known as the Cold War. The Soviet Union and the United States were rivals. The United States did not want the Soviet Union to gain more influence in the region. As a result, the US, along with Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, provided support to the Afghan Mujahideen. This support included money, weapons, and training. Although Osama bin Laden was fighting in a war that received indirect support from Western powers, his personal beliefs were shaped mainly by religious ideas rather than by global politics. Over time, Osama began to spend more time inside Afghanistan itself. He visited battle zones and sometimes took part in combat. Reports from that period suggest that he gained respect among some fighters because he was willing to share hardships. He did not live in luxury while others suffered. Instead, he stayed in simple camps and faced difficult mountain conditions. Afghanistan's terrain is harsh, with high mountains, cold winters, and limited roads. Living and fighting there required endurance and discipline. One important moment in his rise came during battles in the mid-1980s. Some accounts describe his involvement in fighting near Jaji in 1987. This battle was later presented by his supporters as proof of his courage. Whether his military role was large or small, the story helped build his reputation among Arab fighters. He was no longer just a wealthy donor, he was becoming a symbol of commitment to the cause. In 1984, Osama bin Laden and Abdullah Azzam helped establish an organization called Maktab al-Khidmat, also known as the Services Bureau. This organization was created to support foreign volunteers traveling to Afghanistan. It arranged travel, accommodation, and supplies. The Services Bureau built a network that connected fighters from different countries. This network would later become very important. It allowed communication and cooperation among militants from the Middle East, North Africa, and other regions. During the 1980s, thousands of foreign volunteers traveled to Afghanistan. While the majority of fighters were Afghan, the foreign volunteers brought international attention to the conflict. Osama bin Laden's role in organizing these volunteers helped him build relationships with individuals who shared similar beliefs. These connections would later form the foundation of a more structured organization. As the war continued, the Soviet Union faced heavy losses. The Afghan fighters used guerrilla tactics, attacking Soviet forces in small groups and then retreating into the mountains. The United States supplied advanced weapons, including shoulder-fired missiles that could shoot down helicopters. These weapons changed the balance of the war. By the late 1980s, it became clear that the Soviet Union was struggling to maintain control. In 1988, near the end of the Afghan War, Osama bin Laden and a small group of close associates began discussing the future. They believed that the struggle should not end with Afghanistan. Instead, they thought the network built during the war could be used in other conflicts involving Muslims. Around this time, the foundation for a new group was created. This group would later be known as al-Qaeda, which means the base. The name reflected the idea of a base or foundation for future operations. The war officially ended for the Soviets in 1989, when they withdrew their troops from Afghanistan. For many Afghans, this was seen as a victory. For Osama bin Laden, it confirmed his belief that determined fighters could defeat a powerful superpower. This experience deeply influenced his worldview. He believed that faith, sacrifice, and organization could overcome even the strongest military forces. However, Afghanistan did not become peaceful after the Soviet withdrawal. Different Afghan factions began fighting each other for control. The country fell into civil war. Osama eventually returned to Saudi Arabia, but he did not return as the same person who had left years earlier. He came back with battlefield experience, strong international connections, and a growing belief that armed struggle could shape world events. During this period from 1979 to 1989, several important changes happened in his life. First, he moved from being a student and businessman to becoming deeply involved in armed conflict. Second, he built a global network of supporters and fighters. Third, he developed the belief that a small, committed group could defeat a major power. Finally, he helped lay the groundwork for what would become al-Qaeda. It is important to understand that many people who joined the Afghan war did not imagine the long-term consequences. At the time, the conflict was widely supported in parts of the Muslim world and even received backing from governments that later became enemies of al-Qaeda. The war created connections, training, and experience that would influence global security for decades. In simple terms, the Afghan war was the turning point in Osama bin Laden's life. Before it, he was a wealthy young man influenced by religious ideas. During it, he became an organizer, fundraiser, and participant in a major international conflict. By the end of the war, he had gained confidence, followers, and a clear sense of mission. He believed that Muslims could change history through organized struggle. This belief would guide his actions in the years that followed. The end of the Soviet occupation did not mean the end of his ambitions. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new stage. The networks he built during the Afghan war became the base for future activities. The experience of defeating a superpower shaped his thinking about future conflicts. As he left Afghanistan in 1989, he carried with him not only memories of war, but also a plan for what he believed should come next. By the late 1980s, the war in Afghanistan was coming to an end. The Soviet Union decided to withdraw its troops in 1989 after nearly 10 years of fighting. Many fighters who had joined the Afghan struggle believed they had achieved a great victory. Among them was Osama bin Laden. He and others felt that a powerful superpower had been defeated through faith, organization, and sacrifice. This belief deeply influenced his thinking about the future. Even before the Soviet withdrawal was complete, Osama and a small group of close associates began planning what should happen next. During the Afghan war, thousands of foreign volunteers had traveled to the region. These fighters came from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Yemen, Algeria, and other countries. They had built strong relationships, trained together, and shared similar ideas about religion and politics. Osama believed this network should not disappear after the war. Instead, he thought it should become a permanent organization. Around 1988, discussions took place about creating a structured group. This group would later be known as al-Qaeda, which means the base. The name suggested that it would serve as a base or foundation for future operations. Unlike earlier efforts that mainly focused on helping Afghanistan, this new organization would look beyond one country. Its members believed they should be ready to act wherever they felt Muslims were under threat. At this time, Osama was also influenced by an Egyptian doctor named Ayman al-Zawahiri. Zawahiri had been involved in Islamist movements in Egypt and had experience with underground organizations. He believed that political change could only come through strong and disciplined groups. His ideas about organization and secrecy influenced the structure of al-Qaeda. While Abdullah Azzam had focused on uniting Muslims to defend Afghanistan, Zawahiri emphasized long-term strategy and confrontation with governments he believed were unjust. After the Soviet forces left Afghanistan in 1989, the country did not become peaceful. Different Afghan factions began fighting each other for control. The unity that existed during the war against the Soviets broke apart. Osama became disappointed by this internal conflict. He had imagined that Afghanistan would become a model Islamic state after victory. Instead, it fell into civil war. This situation strengthened his belief that stronger leadership and clearer direction were needed. In 1989, Osama returned to Saudi Arabia. He was welcomed by some people as someone who had supported the Afghan struggle. However, he did not simply return to a quiet business life. He continued to speak about political issues and the need for reform in the Muslim world. At that time, the Middle East was facing new challenges. In 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. This event created a major crisis in the region. Saudi Arabia felt threatened and invited foreign troops, mainly from the United States, to help defend the country. This decision deeply angered Osama bin Laden. He believed that non-Muslim foreign troops should not be stationed in the land that contains Islam's holiest cities, Mecca and Medina. He offered to organize Afghan war veterans to defend Saudi Arabia instead. However, the Saudi government rejected his offer and continued to cooperate with the United States and its allies. This disagreement marked a turning point in his relationship with the Saudi leadership. During the Gulf War of 1990 and 1991, U.S.-led forces successfully pushed Iraqi troops out of Kuwait. However, American soldiers remained in Saudi Arabia even after the war ended. Osama publicly criticized this continued presence. He argued that it showed weakness and dependence on foreign powers. His speeches and statements became more political and more confrontational. As a result, the Saudi government began to see him as a problem. In 1991, facing growing pressure, Osama left Saudi Arabia and moved to Sudan. Sudan at that time was governed by an Islamist-leaning government that welcomed individuals who shared similar views. In Sudan, Osama tried to build a new base for his activities. He invested in businesses such as farming, construction, and trading companies. These businesses helped provide financial support for his network. At the same time, he allowed members of his organization to train and organize there. During his years in Sudan, al-Qaeda became more structured. The group developed training programs and began planning operations beyond Afghanistan. Members came from different countries, bringing experience from earlier conflicts. While not yet widely known to the global public, al-Qaeda was slowly becoming a more organized and focused network. In 1994, the Saudi government officially removed Osama bin Laden's citizenship. They also froze his financial assets in the country. This action made him effectively stateless. Losing his citizenship was both symbolic and practical. It showed that his break with Saudi Arabia was complete. From this point on, he openly opposed the Saudi government and accused it of corruption and weakness. Throughout the early 1990s, small attacks connected to extremist networks began to appear in different regions. Some were directed at Western targets, while others focused on local governments. Although al-Qaeda was not always directly involved, the environment of militancy was growing. Osama's statements increasingly criticized the United States, accusing it of interfering in Muslim countries and supporting governments he opposed. In 1996, international pressure on Sudan increased. The United States and other countries accused Sudan of supporting militant groups. Under this pressure, Sudan asked Osama to leave. He then returned to Afghanistan. By that time, a group called the Taliban had taken control of much of the country. The Taliban promised stability after years of civil war. They allowed Osama and his followers to settle in areas under their control. When Osama returned to Afghanistan in 1996, he issued a public declaration calling for resistance against U.S. forces in the Middle East. This statement marked a clear shift. His message was no longer only about defending specific territories. It had become broader and more confrontational. He argued that the presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia and U.S. involvement in other Muslim countries justified armed opposition. This period from 1988 to 1996 was important because it transformed al-Qaeda from a loose network formed during the Afghan War into a more defined organization with global ambitions. It was also the time when Osama moved from criticizing local governments to focusing strongly on the United States as a main opponent. His experiences during the Gulf War, his exile from Saudi Arabia, and his time in Sudan shaped his worldview. In simple terms, several major developments happened during this period. First, al-Qaeda was formally organized. Second, Osama's relationship with the Saudi government broke down completely. Third, he moved from Saudi Arabia to Sudan and then back to Afghanistan. Fourth, His speeches and declarations became more direct and political. These steps laid the groundwork for future conflicts. It is important to remember that during these years, many governments did not yet see al-Qaeda as the major threat it would later become. The group operated mostly in the background, building connections and planning quietly. However, the ideas and networks developed during this time would later lead to actions that had global consequences. By 1996, Osama bin Laden was no longer simply a former supporter of the Afghan war. He had become the leader of a growing militant organization with an international vision. He had lost his citizenship, left his home country, and committed himself fully to a path of confrontation. The foundations built during this period shaped the events that would unfold in the late 1990s and early 2000s. In 1996, Osama bin Laden left Sudan and returned to Afghanistan. Sudan had asked him to leave because of international pressure. At that time, Afghanistan was under the control of a group called the Taliban. The Taliban had risen to power after years of civil war that followed the Soviet withdrawal. They promised order and strict religious rule. Many Afghans were tired of fighting between rival groups, so the Taliban were able to take control of most of the country. When Osama arrived in Afghanistan, the Taliban allowed him and his followers to settle there. The relationship between Osama and the Taliban leadership was based on shared religious beliefs and mutual benefit. The Taliban gave him protection and space to operate. In return, Osama offered financial support and loyalty. This arrangement gave al-Qaeda a safe base once again, similar to what it had during the earlier Afghan war. Soon after returning to Afghanistan, Osama made his views more public. In 1996, he released a statement criticizing the presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia. He said that foreign military forces should not remain in the land that contains Islam's holiest cities. His message was no longer only directed at local governments. It directly challenged the United States. This marked a clear change in tone. He was now speaking to a global audience. In 1998, Osama and other militant leaders issued another public declaration. This statement called for attacks against American interests. It was presented as a religious duty, though many Muslim scholars rejected this interpretation. The declaration increased concern among governments around the world. Intelligence agencies began paying closer attention to al-Qaeda's activities. Later in 1998, 2 U.S. embassies in East Africa were bombed. The attacks happened in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Hundreds of people were killed, and thousands were injured. Many of the victims were African civilians. The United States quickly accused al-Qaeda of responsibility. These bombings brought Osama bin Laden's name to international headlines. He was now widely known outside of conflict zones. In response, the United States launched missile strikes against targets in Afghanistan, where it believed al-Qaeda members were located. These strikes were meant to weaken the organization and send a warning. However, they did not stop al-Qaeda's activities. Instead, the group continued to operate from Afghanistan, where it maintained training camps and planning centers. During this period, al-Qaeda worked to strengthen its network. Fighters trained in camps in Afghanistan and then traveled to different regions. The organization developed skills in communication, secrecy, and planning. It also built connections with smaller extremist groups in other countries. These relationships helped spread its influence. In 2000, another major attack occurred. The USS Cole, a U.S. Navy ship, was bombed while refueling in Yemen. 17 American sailors were killed. The United States again blamed al-Qaeda. This attack showed that the group could strike military targets, not only embassies or civilian buildings. The event increased tensions between the United States and the Taliban government in Afghanistan, which was accused of giving shelter to Osama. Throughout these years, Osama often appeared in video recordings. In these messages, he explained his views and criticized U.S. foreign policy. He spoke about conflicts in places like Palestine and Iraq. He argued that Western involvement in Muslim countries was unjust. These messages were distributed through media channels and helped build his image among supporters, while also increasing global concern about his influence. Life inside Afghanistan during this time was difficult. The country was very poor after years of war. Infrastructure was damaged, and many people struggled to survive. The Taliban enforced strict rules on society. International recognition of the Taliban government was limited. Only a few countries officially recognized it. This isolation made Afghanistan a place where groups like al-Qaeda could operate with less outside interference. As the year 2001 approached, tensions between al-Qaeda and the United States continued to grow. Intelligence agencies were tracking possible threats, but many details remained unclear. Al-Qaeda members were operating in different countries, sometimes quietly planning complex operations. The organization's leadership believed that dramatic action would change global politics and weaken what they saw as foreign control in Muslim lands. On September 11, 2001, coordinated attacks took place in the United States. Airplanes were hijacked and crashed into buildings in New York City and near Washington, D.C. Thousands of people were killed. The attacks shocked the world. Governments, citizens, and media organizations reacted with disbelief and grief. The United States quickly identified al-Qaeda as the group responsible and named Osama bin Laden as the main leader behind the attacks. The U.S. government demanded that the Taliban hand over Osama bin Laden. The Taliban refused, asking for evidence and negotiations. This refusal led to a major decision by the United States. In October 2001, the U.S., along with allied forces, launched a military operation in Afghanistan. The goal was to remove the Taliban from power and destroy al-Qaeda's base. Airstrikes began against Taliban and al-Qaeda positions. Within weeks, Taliban control weakened. Many leaders fled or went into hiding. Osama bin Laden also disappeared from public view. Reports suggested he had escaped into mountainous areas near the Pakistan border. The fall of the Taliban government marked the end of this period and the beginning of a long international conflict. The years from 1996 to 2001 were crucial in shaping modern global security. During this time, al-Qaeda moved from being a relatively unknown organization to becoming one of the most recognized militant groups in the world. The embassy bombings, the USS Cole attack, and especially the September 11th attacks, changed international politics dramatically. For Osama bin Laden, this period represented the height of his influence. He had established a secure base in Afghanistan, strengthened his network, and carried out operations that gained worldwide attention. However, these actions also led to a powerful international response that forced him into hiding. In simple terms, Section 4 shows how his return to Afghanistan gave him the space to expand al-Qaeda's operations. It also explains how a series of major attacks increased global tension and eventually led to war. The decisions made during these years had long-lasting effects. Countries introduced new security laws, increased intelligence cooperation, and launched military operations in different parts of the world. By the end of 2001, Afghanistan had once again become a battlefield. The Taliban were removed from official power, and al-Qaeda's training camps were disrupted. Osama bin Laden was no longer openly giving interviews from Afghanistan. Instead, he became the target of one of the largest manhunts in history. This period closed one chapter and opened another. The safe base that had allowed al-Qaeda to grow was no longer secure. The international response to the September 11th attacks reshaped global politics, military strategy, and security systems. The events between 1996 and 2001 remain some of the most studied and discussed moments in modern history because of their deep and lasting impact. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, the world changed in many ways. Governments increased security. Airports introduced new rules. Intelligence agencies expanded their operations. The United States began what it called the War on Terror. At the center of this global effort was Osama bin Laden, who was accused of planning and leading the attacks through al-Qaeda. In October 2001, the United States, along with allies, launched a military operation in Afghanistan. The goal was to remove the Taliban from power and destroy al-Qaeda's base. Airstrikes targeted training camps, communication centers, and Taliban military positions. Ground forces worked with Afghan groups that opposed the Taliban. Within weeks, major cities such as Kabul fell to anti-Taliban forces. The Taliban government collapsed quickly, but many of its leaders escaped. Osama bin Laden also avoided capture. During the final months of 2001, reports suggested that bin Laden was hiding in the mountains near the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. One important battle took place in an area called Tora Bora. US and allied Afghan forces believed he was hiding there. Heavy fighting occurred, but he managed to escape. This escape allowed him to remain free for many more years. After losing its main base in Afghanistan, al-Qaeda changed its structure. It became more decentralized. Instead of operating large training camps openly, it relied on smaller groups and secret cells in different countries. Some members moved into Pakistan's border regions. Others traveled to the Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia. The organization encouraged local groups to act in its name, even if they were not directly controlled from one central location. Meanwhile, the United States expanded military operations beyond Afghanistan. In 2003, the US invaded Iraq, saying it was part of the fight against terrorism and weapons threats. Although Iraq was not directly linked to the September 11th attacks, the war created instability in the region. Some extremist groups in Iraq later declared loyalty to al-Qaeda. Over time, these conflicts changed the shape of militant movements in the Middle East. During the years after 2001, Osama bin Laden remained in hiding. He did not appear in public. Instead, he released video and audio messages from unknown locations. These recordings were sent to media organizations and broadcast worldwide. In his messages, he criticized US foreign policy and praised attacks carried out by militants. Governments analyzed these recordings carefully, looking for clues about his location. Intelligence agencies from many countries worked together to track him. They followed financial networks, communication patterns, and personal contacts. The search involved thousands of officers, analysts, and military personnel. It became one of the longest and most expensive manhunts in history. Even so, for many years, there was little clear information about his exact whereabouts. During this time, al-Qaeda continued to inspire or plan attacks in different parts of the world. Bombings occurred in places such as Bali in 2002, Madrid in 2004, and London in 2005. These attacks caused many deaths and increased fear in different countries. Governments responded by strengthening anti-terror laws and increasing surveillance. Some people supported these measures for safety reasons, while others worried about civil liberties. Inside Afghanistan, fighting continued. After the Taliban were removed from power, a new Afghan government was formed with international support. However, the Taliban reorganized and began an insurgency. The conflict became long and difficult. NATO forces joined the effort to support the Afghan government. The war lasted for many years, with ongoing violence and instability. Pakistan also became an important part of the story. Many militants used border regions between Afghanistan and Pakistan as hiding places. The area had rough terrain and limited government control. Intelligence officials believed that bin Laden might be somewhere in this region, but finding him was extremely difficult. Over time, some leaders of al-Qaeda were captured or killed in military operations. For example, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, accused of helping plan the September 11th attacks, was captured in 2003. Other senior figures were targeted by drone strikes or special forces raids. Each operation weakened the organization's leadership, but it did not completely end its activities. By the late 2000s, intelligence officials focused on finding one of bin Laden's trusted couriers. They believed that this courier might lead them to him. Years of investigation slowly built a clearer picture. Analysts studied phone calls, travel patterns, and reports from informants. Finally, they identified a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, that seemed suspicious. The building was larger and more secure than others in the area. It had high walls and limited communication with the outside world. After months of surveillance, US officials concluded that bin Laden might be living inside the compound. President Barack Obama approved a secret operation to capture or kill him. The mission was carried out on May 2, 2011 by US Navy SEALs. They flew by helicopter into Abbottabad at night. The operation lasted less than an hour. During the raid, Osama bin Laden was killed. After the operation, his body was taken into U.S. custody and later buried at sea. The U.S. government announced his death publicly. Crowds gathered in some American cities to celebrate the news. Leaders from around the world reacted in different ways. Some said it brought justice. Others warned that extremist movements might continue even without him. His death marked a major moment in the war on terror. For nearly 10 years after September 11th, he had been the main symbol of al-Qaeda. Removing him was seen as a significant achievement for U.S. intelligence and military forces. However, it did not immediately end militant violence. Other leaders stepped forward, and related groups continued to operate. The period from 2001 to 2011 was defined by global efforts to fight terrorism. Security systems changed worldwide. International cooperation between intelligence agencies increased. Military operations expanded into different countries. At the same time, debates about human rights, privacy, and the costs of war became more intense. For Osama bin Laden, these 10 years were spent in hiding. He moved from being a visible leader giving interviews in Afghanistan to living secretly inside a compound. His ability to avoid capture for so long showed how complex the search was. Yet in the end, careful intelligence work and international cooperation led to his location being discovered. On May 2, 2011, the United States announced that Osama bin Laden had been killed during a secret military operation in Abbottabad, Pakistan. The mission was carried out by U.S. Navy SEALs after years of intelligence work. For almost a decade after the September 11th attacks, he had been the most wanted man in the world. His death marked the end of a long search, but it did not end the wider conflict connected to his organization. After the operation, the U.S. government explained that his body had been buried at sea. Officials said this was done to prevent his grave from becoming a place of public attention. News of his death spread quickly across the world. In the United States, many people gathered in public places to react to the announcement. Some felt relief. Others reflected quietly on the long years of war that had followed the 2001 attacks. World leaders responded in different ways. Some described his death as an important step in the fight against terrorism. Others warned that extremist groups might continue even without him. Governments increased security in case of possible retaliation. Intelligence agencies monitored communications to watch for threats. At the time of his death, al-Qaeda was no longer as centralized as it had been before 2001. Years of military pressure had weakened its leadership structure. Many senior members had been captured or killed. However, the organization had developed branches in different regions. These branches operated with some independence while still using the al-Qaeda name. Because of this structure, the group did not disappear after his death. After 2011, leadership of al-Qaeda passed to Ayman al-Zawahiri, who had been one of his closest associates for many years. Zawahiri tried to maintain the group's unity, but the global environment had changed. New conflicts were rising in the Middle East and North Africa. In some areas, newer extremist groups gained attention and power. These changes reduced al-Qaeda's central role, though it continued to exist. The death of Osama bin Laden also had political effects inside Pakistan. The fact that he had been living in Abbottabad, a city not far from military institutions, raised many questions. International observers debated how he had managed to live there for years without being discovered. This created tension between Pakistan and the United States. Both governments faced difficult discussions about intelligence cooperation and trust. In Afghanistan, the war continued even after his death. The Taliban insurgency did not end in 2011. International forces remained in the country for many more years. The conflict showed that the situation was more complex than the presence of one individual. Militant movements had local roots and political causes that went beyond al-Qaeda's leadership. In the United States and Europe, the years after 2011 saw ongoing debates about security policies introduced after September 11th. Laws related to surveillance, airport security, and counter-terrorism remained in place. Some people believed these measures were necessary for safety. Others believed they limited personal freedoms. These discussions became part of the long-term legacy of the period connected to bin Laden's actions. Another important part of his legacy is how extremist ideas spread through the internet. During the 1990s, communication was slower and more limited. By the 2010s, online platforms allowed messages to move quickly across borders. Even after his death, recordings and writings connected to him remained available online. Governments and technology companies faced challenges in controlling extremist propaganda while protecting freedom of speech. At the same time, many Muslim scholars and community leaders around the world continued to reject his interpretation of religion. They emphasized peaceful teachings and worked to prevent radicalization among young people. In many countries, efforts were made to promote education and dialogue to reduce the appeal of extremist groups. His death also became part of historical study. Universities, journalists, and researchers examined the events leading to his rise and fall. They studied the Afghan War, the formation of al-Qaeda, and the international response after 2001. By looking at these events, experts tried to understand how similar movements could be prevented in the future. The wars connected to his actions had deep human costs. Thousands of soldiers and civilians died in Afghanistan and Iraq. Many more were injured or displaced. Families across different countries experienced loss. Economically, the cost of military operations and security programs was extremely high. These effects lasted long after 2011. In simple terms, his death closed a chapter, but did not erase the impact of his life. The organization he created weakened, but extremist violence did not completely disappear. The global system of counterterrorism that developed after 2001 continued to shape international relations. Airports remained heavily secured. Intelligence cooperation between countries stayed strong. Military strategies evolved to address non-state groups rather than traditional armies. Over time, public attention shifted to other global issues, such as economic crises, regional conflicts, and health emergencies. However, the memory of September 11th and the decade-long manhunt remained an important part of modern history. For younger generations, these events are studied in textbooks rather than remembered from personal experience. Looking back, several key themes define his long-term legacy. First, small networks can have global impact when they use modern communication and symbolic targets. Second, military victory against one leader does not automatically solve deeper political and social problems. Third, international cooperation is essential in addressing threats that cross borders. By the mid-2010s and beyond, al-Qaeda's influence had declined compared to its peak years. Other groups sometimes use different names and strategies, showing that extremist movements can change form. Governments continued to adapt their responses, focusing on intelligence sharing, financial tracking, and prevention programs.